And also talking about the podcast. Before the podcast.
We have our first Geisteswissenschaftler.
Yeah, just to open that mise en abîme in a verbal way.
Excuse me, what did you just say?
That sound is also a bit dangerous to have on the podcast, especially if we're gonna talk about taboo noises.
Imply a taboo noise.
Yeah.
Welcome to the ACIT podcast, the official podcast of the Association for Critical and Interdisciplinary Thinking. We have a somewhat more relaxed intro now, but we are still hoping to provide you with thought-provoking and stimulating conversations with researchers from all kinds of backgrounds and from all over the world. As always, you can find out more about us at www.acit-science.com. And now, without any further ado, let's jump right in.
Hello, I'm here with Sven Bloching.
Hello.
It's always a bit arbitrary to start recording after we've already hung out for a little bit, but we decided to have as a icebreaker the first question to ask Sven what is funny about jokes and fart jokes in particular.
Yeah.
This is going to get scientific.
This is going to get really scientific.
Yeah.
No. Okay, so just as the icebreaker, I would give the answer that jokes about farts or farts themselves are funny because they are somehow inconvenient, or they are covered by shame, usually culturally as well as individually. So if you do fart, or if you talk about farting, just like we now also giggling like school kids, for one, you need some sort of like social corrective to assure that it is still not completely normal to talk about farts or to fart. So by laughing, you kind of fulfill the ritual of breaking a norm, and then someone laughs to mark the very action as a sort of breach of norm, or breach of taboo for that matter. And then also, of course, it is pleasurable to explicit something that is always in everyday life some sort of suppressed. So it can give you a feeling of deliberation and freedom, and kind of a valve-like release of aggression, to like with the same aggression that you have to suppress your whole farting existence. That exact same aggression is released at the moment of farting. But it doesn't just go for farts, obviously. So that's why it might be funny if somebody gets kicked in the balls in a sitcom, or if somebody makes a vulgar joke, or if somebody just pulls out their dick, or virtually anything that is usually controlled or suppressed in everyday life. I know I sound very Freudian, but it's just because the idea derives from Freud.
Yeah,
actually.
Yeah, there were a lot of things in there already that we could delve into from a more formal scientific perspective. Maybe just to illustrate for our listeners why you are so interested in these taboo topics, and from which kind of perspective, from the perspective of language, and the study of language and how taboo breaking works in kind of in a linguistic context, what kind of research you are doing there, and how you came to be, how you became a researcher in that field, and what motivates you to look into these topics.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. So I think for one, obviously, like everyone, I find it kind of exciting to talk about and research about taboo topics. I mean, everybody finds it somehow exciting because it's not at all profane. So it is either super disgusting and repulsive, or super attractive, or both at the same time.
Yeah.
Probably the latter in most cases. So I'm not free of those effects that I'm researching myself, obviously. And then on a more intellectual level, it was kind of a defiant act, I would say, because I've always liked punk rock and battle rap and that kind of youth culture, like the kind of oppositional culture to the parental main culture. And I've always, or especially when I continued my studies, I found it some kind of ridiculous how poorly effects of certain language is just anticipated but stated as a fact. I mean, when we went to school, we had the problem with video games, I guess. There was some horrible school shooting, and people found out that the specific school shooter had for example, Counter-Strike on their computer, and then they just draw the causation from violent video games to violence in real life. But that can be a satisfying answer, or at least that is not a method that you should apply in any scientific research. So, but since I'm not a researcher in video games or anything like that, my concern goes for language, but also in a artistic area. So what I'm looking at is German battle rap that is being criticized for having a bad influence. And while it's fair enough to be concerned about that, it's obviously, but even on scientific or pseudoscientific articles, you can just read assumptions about how that would affect anyone without any sort of concern with regards to how could you actually find out how that could affect any listeners. So that's what I wanted to do actually in my master thesis, is to actually look into what are the mental correlates of how certain taboo breaches actually affect the recipients.
So yeah, I think the main example of taboo breaking you looked into was more specifically in Germany the Echo Preisverleihung, where two famous German rappers were awarded the Echo, but it was later determined, or like pretty soon afterwards was found out, in quotation marks, by the public that they had made allegedly anti-Semitic comments and like a lot of I don't know how you want to call it, racist, misogynistic, like all of the bad things in quotation marks. Used a lot of these expressions on their album, and consecutively there was this huge outcry. The public was angry for them getting the prize, and that prize doesn't even exist now anymore because it was completely
abolished
I guess, out of existence, because there was this friction between the taboo topics discussed on this album and the general public, the German public represented by this Echo Prize for these musicians, that really didn't know how to handle, or was really collapsed internally by the kind of pressure, the friction caused by this, by these different elements, by this taboo preaching. So I think it's really fascinating to look into what actually causes these taboos, why there's so much potential in them, why this taboo breaking actually happens, from like a psychological perspective as well. Why are human beings so drawn to taboo breakings, and why at the same time the society is so horrible at handling them and really talking about them and conceptualizing them. So there were a couple of things already. You mentioned the Freudian perspective that taboo breakings are really in some way correlated to the psychological element of aggression and autoaggression as well. But before we get into the details of taboos, can you define in a broad sense what a taboo actually is?
Yeah, that is actually, as always, it's almost the hardest part of the work to define what you're actually talking about, at least in humanities. So usually taboos are concerned with something that may not be said or done, but unlike other prohibitions, it should also not be thought or even mentioned. So it is a sort of permission to touch something. So it was imported from Polynesian islands by James Cook in his journals, and it's still maybe that's why, but maybe not. But somehow it still has that kind of mana-like magic to it, the taboo. So it is sort of irrational, but also not. so mainly, unlike any other prohibitions, it cannot be written down what is taboo and what is not. There cannot be some sort of canon. Is there an English word too?
Yeah.
Canon?
Yeah.
There cannot be like the book of rules of words you cannot say, because in order to write that book, you would have to in some way say the words. So there's also that famous, was it George Carlin? Was that his name? That famous comedian who just enumerated all the words that you're not supposed to say on air. Mm. So that's sort of the meta level of taboos. Why also people are afraid of saying the N-word, including me. So obviously it is some sort of awkward to say the N-word. That's why people just say the first letter and then word, because they're not afraid only to use it, so to do some sort of action with the words, but they're also afraid of talking about the action someone might do with that word. So they're afraid of mentioning the word. So that's a big difference between taboos and other sorts of prohibitions, is that they are not codified. And therefore, like some other social norms, they're highly dependent on the context. So a culture is not only defined by its rules, but also, and maybe even more crucially, by the rules of breaking those rules. And the same goes for taboos. So obviously some words are taboo, but there are rules within which you can break the taboo safely without being sanctioned.
That might also go back to the farting introduction. Because there's some context where you can fart, but then people have to laugh to kind of, because you know it might be okay in some certain environment, but then you have to kind of sanction it by laughing about it, by releasing the tension inherent in the act of breaking the taboo.
Yeah, there has to be some sort of social corrective mainly, but I mean, it can be more or less awkward to just drop a fart in a room full of people. I mean, if that room is full of your friends, especially if they have the same gender, I guess, then it has a whole different effect. And if Eminem, for example, gets on stage and puts his buttocks to the microphone and farts into the microphone, that is a whole nother thing than if someone is just farting like more or less by accident.
Yeah, it's like Yo-Yo Ma playing the cello, dropping a fart on stage. So that's maybe a nice point to kind of transition into this connection between taboo breaking and subculture, because Eminem obviously is an artist that represents a very different subculture than people like Yo-Yo Ma that represent this world of classical serious music, and rap is always associated to a certain degree with kind of rule breaking, with subculture, with an opposition to the main culture that determines a certain set of rules that are there to be broken by the subculture. So what roles do taboos play in a subculture like gangster rap, for example?
I think mainly they are just a great tool, because I mean, they would be even a greater tool if they're spelled out, and if you have like a book of things you ought not do in main culture. But I mean, since every person who defines themselves as part of some certain subculture is also socialized in main culture, that's why it's the metaphor of main and sub, obviously. They know all the taboos. They know what you should not do. Eminem knows that barfing and farting into a microphone is not considered as polite or okay, or even merely okay or anything. But he does it not despised, but because of that. So the use of that is to repulse everyone who doesn't, so to say, understand it. I think we have to start on a more local level to actually appreciate that. And maybe it's weird to try to appreciate Eminem farting into a microphone. But for example, let's just stick to the example of farting. You could do anything, even a sexist joke or anything. If you make that joke about farting, for example, and someone laughs, then you have a special connection to that person, because there is some sort of bond, because you're closer to them than you are to any public person who doesn't know you, because in front of them you would not dare to make the joke, and it wouldn't work either. They would not laugh, probably. So taboo, the ritual of breaking a taboo and the subsequent laughing is sort of, or the successive laughing is sort of bonding between people. And if you do that on a little larger scale, like for example at washing places where women had mainly women or only women had to wash clothes, and then they were just among each other, and then they could talk about anything and make sexist jokes and make vulgar jokes and all that, and then they could feel a special connection, and anybody who would walk by would hear the vulgar talk and would also get like funnily or wittily insulted to demark the in-group from the out-group. So you have the same when you crack jokes with your friends. Whoever is just passing by and doesn't understand it, or who does not laugh, or who even reinforces the normal sanction mechanisms that apply to, for example, sexism, if it is not considered a good joke, they mark themselves as outsiders of that respective group. So ritualized taboo breaches, deliberate taboo breaches have that use of demarking in-group and out-group. And you can extend that to a larger scale to form like a whole subculture, especially in explicit opposition to a main culture. But then obviously you have all the problems of the medial transport of your message. that might not be considered as a ritual anymore. So it might not be considered as some sort of joke. And if we stick to the example of the sexist joke, people might think you're an actual sexist and not actually making fun of sexism. So, and I believe that is where most of the tension comes from, because sexist jokes have existed forever, but obviously we hear more of them because, for one, sexism itself is a bigger issue than it used to be. And secondly, be it sexist jokes or racist jokes or any kind of joke, actually, they just get distributed medially way more and in way more advanced ways than they used to be. So chances are high that they are reaching people who do not at all understand from the context that something is intended as a joke. And so they have to contextualize it with their usual ways of interpretation, which in that case obviously would be sexism or racism.
So I think there were a couple of things in there that we can pursue in more detail. I think the first interesting thing was the example of the washing woman in this public square, which really created this specific place in society that was also physically demarcated from other places, because it acquired that special function much in the same way that church acquires that sacred meaning for service on a Sunday. In that sense, also the washing square, the public place, acquired that meaning of being this specific outlet of profanity, so to speak, and of deliberate taboo breaking. And there are also other examples of that. For example, wrestling, that we can also talk about in more detail. Wrestling and to the carnival, this ritual of people going out on the streets and being drunk. And in Venice, this they call like carnival as well, where people were just wearing masks and running around the streets drunk, and everyone was like profane and having sex with everyone else, and like no one knew who was involved in this frenzy of taboo breaking.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that seems to be like a specific property of taboo breakings, that they used to be at least tied to specific places in society, and also in the subculture there existed these specific places that really shut them, the process of the ritualized taboo breaking that you mentioned, off from the main culture. And as you just mentioned, we have to take this kind of shift into account of how media is distributed nowadays, and also these, in quotation marks, taboo breaking media forms are distributed. So can you talk about what happened there, and
mm-hmm.
from what perspective you can think about this?
Yeah, so the main thing, I think you summed up properly, actually. So even though, like I said, it's not only about, you don't only have to know about the rules, but also about the rules within which you can break the rules. So even though something is taboo, there is a place and time almost for everything. There is a place and time where you can breach the taboo without being sanctioned. We talked about, before the podcast, we talked about Foucault and his takes on BDSM as a sexual practice. And that might actually be a quite good example because, for example, you would never hit the person you love, but during sex, some people might enjoy that. So before sex, you would never do that. After sex, you would never do that. But within the more or less ritual of the sexual intercourse, you might hit a woman. You might hit your partner, whatever the gender. And everybody, you don't have to write down that you're not going to hit each other before sex or after sex, only during sex, and all that. You don't need that, because there's the ritual and it sort of defines itself. And within that ritual, things are possible and doable that are usually not doable without sanction and without someone being hurt, for example. So that is a crucial point. And I guess before media came around, there wasn't a big problem, at least not morally, because whoever didn't want to take part just didn't. If you didn't want to go to a kind of appointed brawl, for example, if some guys just wanted to meet in a backyard and have a boxing match against each other, you just didn't do it. And in the same way, if you didn't like the cussing contests of the American cowboys in those days, or the Stanzeln in Tirol, or the Agon in ancient Greece, like so many cultures had those rituals of insulting each other that I just enumerated, and many more, and also the dissing contests, or the playing the dozens, also called, among African Americans. If you didn't want to be insulted, even in a ritual manner, then you just didn't go there. Easy as that seems. So the real problem morally really kicks in when the products of these rituals get replicated and distributed in a free market where everybody can buy them, and where people do receive them without actually wanting to receive them, in the linguistic sense of receive. So they do hear words they do not want to hear, and they read words they do not want to read, like in the example with the rappers that won the Echo Prize. So, and they never agreed to that kind of ritual, and in many cases they don't even know that it is some sort of insult ritual. So they have no way to understand or to contextualize certain utterances. Then the politic, that is at least what Walter Benjamin wrote down, who wrote that sort of ahead of its time article on the replication of artwork, that if the artwork loses its foundation in the ritual, where it fulfills its usual or original function, then you have no other way to interpret it than in a sort of political or moral way, because that's basically anything that's left.
Yeah, so to maybe rephrase that point in a different way, is that really this gangster rap music originally derived really from this locally kind of contained space of these rap rituals that also have these connections to a lot of other examples that you just elaborated on, where you have this sanctioned space where you can do this taboo breaking. But now suddenly in the age where the artwork is not really constrained to this space anymore, but is reproduced on CDs, on Spotify, on YouTube, then you suddenly kind of dislodge this work of art from this constrained space, and then there's really no context. If you hear something on the radio, the implicit assumption is that it's part of the mainstream culture, and then if like a taboo breaking arises in the topic of this mainstream media, then it suddenly completely shifts its meaning, and you can't really contextualize it in the usual sense anymore, and then this friction comes into being that people seem to have such a hard time dealing with.
I think that's where actually the importance of the death of the author kicks in. Maybe we can make a transition there.
Yeah, sure.
So what is important is...
It was a beer. Talking about taboo breakings.
Yeah, fair enough. Cheers. Cheers. And so what is important to keep in mind, and within the humanities, that is sort of a platitude, but I think it's still important, is that meaning is not produced by the producer of the words. So we have these metaphors of like sender and receiver, which suggest that the sender puts something with it in a box, so that something would be meaning and the box would be a word, and then he sends it to the receiver, and the receiver, she would just open the box and find the meaning there, just the way that the sender put it in. But obviously that is not at all the case, because where would all that cognition be in just an arbitrary sign? So if you read something, all the sense that you get out of it, you do not get out of it. You do not get it out of it. It's in some way it has to always have been inside your head beforehand, because where would it come from? And that's really the magical thing about language, actually. And that's why I do kind of understand that people have all these magic beliefs about language, just like taboos, which is a sort of magical belief. But it's crucial to understand that you are the one who is making the meaning of the text. So if you feel like, for example, a text is sexist, then that relies on the presupposition that you interpret the sex of certain individuals within the text. So there's for example, there's been another scandal with battle rap songs with a feminist association called Terre de Femme, who quoted rap lyrics and afterwards criticized them as violence against women. And one of those rap lyrics says, obviously I'm translating and paraphrasing, it says, "They hear you scream because thanks to me there's glass splitters in your loop." And that is being received as sexist. But the presuppositions before that are that the speaking person has a different gender as the person that he's talking about. So we know that the rapper identifies himself as a man, but he's not talking about the gender of the victim in that case. But we are just asserting that. So that's just one example. And obviously collective identity and social identity plays a huge role in that, because it's always constructed, and it's always, in many cases, even constructed by the people that are criticizing it, which makes it so hard to actually pinpoint actual acts of sexism or of racism. Because, I don't know, maybe I'm leaving my field here, but I just think it's an important topic. If you, for example, if you see a white person hitting a black person, you cannot, you can assume that it is out of racist reasons, but for that you have to acknowledge that one person has a certain skin color or race or whatever, and the other person has another skin color or race or whatever. So it's always reliant on your own interpretation of the situation. And obviously the same goes even more so for texts which consist of nothing but convention, so the conventional meaning of the words, and your own cognition.
Yeah, and language also changes meaning in the course of years passing, and in the course of the society redefining certain terms. In that context, Steven Pinker talks about the euphemistic treadmill that's also kind of concerned with words that are taboo at a certain point in time, and then that get kind of redefined by society as an attempt to kind of take the sting out of the word, or to really get rid of the taboo, but that usually doesn't work. Can you explain what the treadmill actually alludes to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the treadmill is actually a quite interesting phenomenon that answers or gives sort of a hint to the question what actually is taboo. And maybe we should have dealt with that in the beginning. But so it is not obvious if a concept is taboo, or a thing itself is taboo, or if the word referring to the thing itself or to the concept respectively is taboo. So there are certain concepts that are taboo almost in every culture. That would include feces and body and their effluvia, and sexuality and death, and sometimes even food. But whenever you find a new word for the specific concept, that word also gets taboo. So we have these famous examples of the place where you shit, of the place of the toilet. Let's just call it that. And obviously the toilet is a euphemism, because toilet just has a meaning close to a washing ritual, or to just wash yourself. And before that we had like locus, which is just simply a place. And also toilet is gotten kind of vulgar, so you would call it maybe water closet, but it's just a closet with water in it. That's not really what you're talking about. So it's really hard to pinpoint the actual thing in the world that you mean. And then obviously you have the restroom, which is not at all the bedroom, and you don't at all rest there.
Sometimes maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
Spend too much time with your phone.
Yeah, maybe that, or maybe if you're drunk.
Yeah, some people are known to have accidentally rested.
Yeah, we've all been there. But the point is, some researchers argued that since there's always a new word, so since you can circumvent the taboo by just using another word for it, even just a foreign word with the same meaning, what is taboo has to be the word that you use to refer to the certain object. And that kind of makes sense, because if you use the new word, it is not taboo anymore to refer to the same object, for example, the toilet. But then, after a while, if you use the new word for the same object again and again and again, and it gets sort of conventionalized, everybody knows what you are talking about, and it's too explicit again. And then you have to come with a new word. I mean, I think Pinker makes the example with handicapped people. And that's actually the problem. You cannot talk about these topics without using either some sort of euphemism or politically correct language, or feeling kind of awkward if you start to use words like retard or cripple. And that's actually Pinker's point there. It used to be cripple, and the word used to be cripple, and there was no problem with it, and then it used to be retard, and that was actually sort of the politically correct term. And then it got awkward too, and then you had, I don't know, handicapped, and then you had like physically challenged and whatnot. And that is all reliant on the understandable feeling that it is sort of awkward to talk about other person's problems, whatever they might be. So we project that onto the sign. So what is taboo is actually the sign, but not only the form of the word, of the utterance, of the expression, but also the concept that grounds it, sort of. So the awkward feelings towards the concept just project themselves on the expression. And so we have to change the expression again and again until we, which is not a cause of the euphemistic treadmill, that is sort of epiphenomenal in my opinion, until we have made enough progress that we are totally fine with the concept as it is, and we can speak about it freely, which I think we have in many cases arrived at with homosexuality, because we didn't have to change. There have been some, at least in German, there has been the problematization of the word schwul, which means gay, but then gay people just use the word normally, like colloquially.
The LGBTQ community, that's like part of the name, is so the gay is kind of integrated into the gay community, so to speak. So by that, it's kind of legitimized as an okay word.
Yeah, exactly. So, and now nobody feels awkward. At least I don't feel awkward talking about gay people or using the word gay, or in German schwul. So it seems like the euphemism treadmill has stopped there, and that is a pretty good indicator that we don't have any hard feelings or feelings of awkwardness talking about homosexuality, at least not anymore in a stronger sense than we are having problems with talking about sexuality in general.
Yeah, you also mentioned this fascinating phenomena of there being these evergreen topics of social taboos that we still haven't overcome to any degree, like certain body parts, the act of going to the toilet, for example. And then this euphemistic treadmill bringing about new expressions day in and day out, and we have this huge assortment of expressions that you can use for the same taboo word, like the example of the male genital organ, for example, where you have these kind of online joke competitions where people try to say like 100 different names for the male sexual organ. And really there being, because it's such a taboo thing, there being so many ways to try to avoid saying the word. Also by me saying male sexual organ instead of penis.
Yeah, and by us laughing about it also.
Yeah. Releasing the tension again. So meta. Yeah, this seems to be like really interesting.
Yeah, that is really ironic, because if you would have an authority, like just a few groups of people who reinforce the taboo, which is not really the case. I mean, it's everyone reinforces it in themselves. But if you would have that would be like the perfect resistance against any authority. And it is the perfect resistance against your own authority, against the own oppression that you are putting on yourself. So I know I'm not supposed to say certain words, so I'm just making fun of that fact that I'm not supposed to say these words, and I'm saying 100 more or less explicit words for the same object to just show myself how ridiculous that idea of circumventing certain words is. And that's Mikhail Bakhtin, the Russian literature critic, wrote a whole book on this, that it's almost the perfect rebellion of the oppressed to just laugh, basically, to just have a culture of laughter that cannot be fought in any way, because it can laugh about anything and just exposes the absurdity and the ambivalence in anything. And I think that is actually a very powerful thing.
Yeah, that seems to be something that's always exploited to a certain degree in art forms, is the ambivalence and the tensions inherent in existence, and in comedy as well. If you consider comedy to not have to be an art form, even in stand-up comedy, and always also a mirror of society. I mean, in the image of the jester, the court jester, for example, you have this kind of precursor to the modern stand-up comedian, even to a certain degree. And that always this jester being at the boundary of what is culturally sanctioned, and this jester even being the only person that is allowed to make fun of the king without like being the authority of the king being put into question, because it's in that framework of kind of stepping out of the taboos, then that humor kind of releases certain tensions inherent in that. And yeah, so in comedy you always play with these words and with these tensions, and it seems to be something that we really enjoy doing and even need to be doing. So maybe to trace back to Freud that we talked about in the beginning, his whole theory of the wits, like wit and the German word witz, and the relationship to the unconscious. Can you explain what this relationship is according to Freud and how that fits in?
Yeah, but I think first to the whole medieval analogy, that is actually where I feel really ambivalent about the power of humor, because in one way it's all that we've just talked about in the past few minutes. On an individual level, it has tremendous power to make fun of, I don't know, your own flaws, make fun of something horrible that happened in your life, which you and I are doing constantly, I guess. We have a kind of dark humor. And it really helps to raise yourself above the problems that you're facing, and to look at the world with all its imperfections, with its ambivalence, its absurdity, its senselessness, and to acknowledge it and derive pleasure from that. That is almost a divine act on an individual level. But then on the Marx level, if you want to say so, on a societal level, it also has some weirdly conservative effects, actually, because like in medieval times, at the carnival, you had the opportunity to laugh about your own fears. I mean, there were places that were called hell, and in the end they lit them on fire and laughed while hell was burning, which is a pretty ironic thing, actually. But then also carnival sort of had the function to serve as a valve to just release all the pressure that was put on people. So they got one day in a full life of misery, they got one fucking day a year where they could make fun of the king, which didn't change anything, but they got to make fun of the king, so their life couldn't be that bad. So they sort of put all of their rebellion and all of their effort in that, except for actually rebelling or actually trying to achieve some sort of social change. So that is the flip side of that. And I'm not sure what if humor in that sense on a societal level is making more harm or more good, because it has that tendency to serve as a sort of co-optation.
Yeah, it reminds me also of the bread and games of the Roman Republic. This kind of also this function of appeasing the public by means of even like a certain element of propaganda that is inherent in that. We give them what they need for a bit, and then we treat them like shit again. So.
Yeah, exactly.
So, from a Marxist perspective, but that's not to be desired for the class that is being ruled. But yeah, I guess it's an interesting element that you always have this. We need to cite Hegel at one point, or this at least used to be the expression dialectical. It's kind of dialectical relationship between the culture that is dominant and these kind of rituals that oppose what's happening in the culture but by that act of opposition, as in the Hegelian self-consciousness, really constitute that main culture to a certain degree by reinforcing it through that act. And like you mentioned also in these subcultures, these acts of like reinforcing kind of this element of being subculture become even a bit frantic or kind of inauthentic to a degree, because that subculture is really subsumed under the main culture. In Germany, for example, a lot of the #1 hits, and also during the Echo scandal, they were awarded that prize because their album was like the best-selling album, almost maybe the best or one of the best-selling albums in Germany for the entire year, period. Not only in the gangster rap genre, but period. And Capital Bra, for example, which is one of the most famous gangster rappers, right now the most successful one, is the best-selling German artist of all time. Yeah,
I think he even has more #1 single hits than the Beatles.
Yeah,
in Germany, he's like 19 or something. Yeah, it's crazy. So that's why I think, from the perspective of the subculture of German rap, be it gangster rap or any rap, that there exists even a category named urban hip hop national or something like that was the category where they won, the two rappers. That this category even exists in the mainstream prize for music in Germany. That is the actual problem, not the scandal that followed after it. So that is actually the worst that can happen to a subculture, that you're so integrated in the market and so integrated in the main culture that you run danger. You face the danger to just get subsumed by it. But the following scandal around the whole breaches of moral norms from the perspective of the main culture, that is actually the best thing that could have happened to the subculture's identity, because then they could reassert themselves, and that's what I found out reading all those articles from within the subculture. They could assert themselves as sort of the oppressed or sort of people from the periphery, and they could identify all their critics as being some sort of bourgeois or old or conservative, because they cling to all these values they asserted. So that was really, not to sound too nihilist, but from the perspective of the subculture, that was the best thing that could have happened. It actually saved, I think it actually saved the career of Kollega and Farid Bang, the two rappers, because once you get the echo and all that, I don't know how much you can call yourself a gangster rapper or something like that anymore. But maybe I'm not right. Maybe, I mean, the market is big. There's space for everyone, and that's the problem, right? Because they want all those cells in the market. They want to make all that money, so they want to happen in the market, and they want to be on Spotify and all that. But they don't want the sanction by the mainstream, by the main culture, and that doesn't work, obviously. I mean, before there was all these streaming platforms. You could have had a sort of overground in hip hop, which was the case in Italy and in Canada, I think, where you could live from just performing and rapping, and you have quite a few listeners, but they would have to go to special stores to buy your CDs or tapes, and that is actually the best case, because nobody is going to criticize you, because then you can just say, yeah, well, then don't come to my concert or don't buy the tape. But that is not possible anymore, because anybody can just stumble upon it and then say, oh, that's not all right in that sense or that sense.
Yeah, it's interesting that, like, within the subculture, one of the biggest insults you can give to an artist is that this person has become sellout to a degree. It's true in the electronic music scene, in the metal subculture, and the rap subculture. So,
and Kollega and Farid Bang used that insult too, ironically, because they are the most mainstream, or at least in that year, they've been the most mainstream, but they insult generically anyone as commercial mainstream sluts. I think would be the translation.
Yeah, it's like diverting attention from yourself.
yeah, maybe like latently homosexual people who would call somebody else a faggot, so that they don't have to deal with their own sexuality.
Yeah, these famous examples of these American these pastors on public TV, this evangelical people on TV that used to rage against homosexuals, and then it was found out that they really engaged very actively. Okay. There were a couple of examples of that, and also
like in American Beauty as well.
That's true. Yeah, right. Yeah, also reminds me of the interesting parallel with respect to politics. The Trump era seems to be over, but there's also this element of really this it seems to be a feature of the way Trump communicates, for example, is to simply provoke, and to simply provoke the liberals, for example, and to really oppose them by saying certain things. And this whole troll culture that comes from that is really also an attempt to, by the means of provocation, to kind of create an identity, and to also, it might also be a form of virtue signaling, or kind of in this hierarchy of societies of asserting alpha male kind of dominance to signal that you can provoke other people. It connects back to this aspect of humor, of like certain people being allowed to saying certain things and being allowed to make certain jokes as a feature of their standing in the hierarchy of society.
Yeah, and then also especially those subcultures who define themselves among taboo breaches, be it battle rap or punk rock or wrestling. I don't know if that is a subculture that much, but I guess you could call it that. They all consider themselves in some sense young, in an intellectual sense, and male, and like not even male but really masculine in the sense of dominant and aggressive, and courageous. So I think I think you actually pinpointed it. And I think the opposition didn't, if we're talking about Trump, I think the opposition didn't really do a great job. Not only Hillary Clinton, but even before that. I think and there's actually a nice book about that by Angela Nagel, Kill All Normies. I could recommend that, which considers that before all the trolls, the right-wing trolls, and also Trump could have rise, there needed to be a sort of really moral and really serious area around from which you could distance. So it is only so for example, when Trump made fun of a journalist who has some sort of handicap, I don't know how to say it in English, it's always awkward. I'm just gonna say handicap. Maybe I'm PC, I don't care. But that could only be interesting to his voters, or funny, or courageous, or in some sense they have to consider it, they have to attribute it in some positive way, otherwise they wouldn't have voted for him, right? So that can only be interesting or courageous or dominant or anything like, or funny or anything like that, if beforehand there has been a very serious culture. And I'm not advocating making fun of anyone in public, that is not the point. But the point is that it is very easy to just act as if you're one of us, even as a billionaire or millionaire, or maybe he's broke again, I don't know. But I mean, the point was, even if he was so rich, mediocre working class people considered Trump like one of us. And they didn't mean the working conditions or money or anything. I think what they meant is pretty close to what we talked about for an hour now. Is that he's not afraid to break taboos, and that he makes this kind of show, and he doesn't take himself that seriously, and he doesn't take anything that seriously, it seems. Yeah. And that makes him sort of relatable, of course in a fake sense, but that strategy is not new. Even in medieval times, priests have done that. I've read in Bachtin at least. So it is sort of easy to appeal to the so-called common people, or to the proletarians, by just acting in that relatable way of being funny and not caring and not giving a fuck, and saying something that you and your friends would say when you're in a bar, but just on a public level. And the more serious the left is in that case, the more appealing it is if some other political figure comes across and just doesn't play along with that. And I'm not saying that's a good thing, because obviously that is actually a horrible thing. So I feel like the left has to regain the sort of funny take it used to have on politics, at least in Germany in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, that has really can have a disarming quality, because, like you mentioned, I think one of the issues the left has been struggling with, especially in the US, but I think globally, is that it's become really associated with this PC culture, and that PC culture kind of has this aura of like sanctity and like sanctimoniousness, that it really has this kind of seriousness about it, that it's taking itself so seriously that it's really easy to, by breaking certain taboos that are instantiated by this.
And I think people, sorry for interrupting, but that's what I wanted to say actually. I think people are intuitively suspicious of that. And maybe they don't know why, and maybe I don't know why, but there is something suspicious to that seriousness all the time. And to that, if we talked about rules and the rules of breaking the rules, in many cases of PC standpoints, there are no rules for breaking the rules. There is no carnival, and there is no stand-up comedy, and there are no rituals within which you could break the rules of political correctness. In some cases, obviously not everybody is advocating for that, but it seems that it is a bigger issue than it used to be. And if you take people this valve, if you take it from them, I mean, we've talked about the conservative function of that valve, and if you take it from them, then I think the consequences could be pretty serious. even though it's a funny topic, but it seems to be pretty important to people.
Yeah, that's always interesting that what's funny is always something that is really important to people to a degree, because we are so subconsciously hyper aware of what's happening in this area. And also that, and there's really this element of not having any kind of moment of breathing and relief from this tension of constantly being hyper aware of what you're doing, what you're saying. Then that really, in Trump, for example, or in general in this troll culture, the act of coming along and really breaking that taboo and not caring about breaking the taboo I think that's a really crucial point, because breaking the taboo doesn't imply what you're saying is, like, if you break the taboo of sexism, doesn't mean you're sexist. If you're breaking the taboo of making fun of handicapped people, doesn't mean you are inherently against handicapped people, whatever that means. And if you're making a comment about like the extreme PC awareness around racism, for example, doesn't mean necessarily you're a racist, but you can for all of the other reasons we addressed in the last hour of what function these taboos have in society. You can just break the taboo for the heck of breaking the taboo.
Exactly.
I think that's kind of the real thing you need to understand in the political landscape of today, that really taboo breaking has a function in its own. And it really, if there were a taboo about drinking from glass bottles or making fun of blonde people, then Trump would probably make fun of that. And we would do it.
Yeah.
And it's really not. It's kind of this layer of meta-analysis that's absolutely crucial for understanding parts of what's going on in public debate. And that's kind of what the result of your master thesis was as well, that in this kind of debate between the main culture that was talking about anti-Semitism in Farid Bang and Kollega, and Farid Bang and Kollega really mainly using these lines to break taboos to
just in order to break a taboo about death and suffering in general, like they did so many times on the album. So I think it is that important to people, because laughter, as Bakhtin writes, laughter cannot be used for fascism or some authoritarian regime, because it always resists that. It's like the force of the people, laughter, because it always exposes some sort of ambivalence. That's how jokes work, right? In the most obvious sense, just in puns, in the ambiguity of a single word, but it always works in some sort of incongruity, or in some sort of surprise, or in some way you always have to rethink what you just thought and reinterpret it in another way. So that's really the power of jokes and of laughter, that it always exposes some sort of ambivalence, and it always shows that nothing is necessary in the epistemic sense, that everything is contingent. So I think that's why it is really important to people to be able to make jokes about everything, and that I think that is actually important also from a conservative point of view. Even if you want people to accept the authority that you put above them, be it political correctness or any other form of authority, then you have to give them a little valve where they can make fun of the very rules that you give them, because otherwise they're gonna be like, no, I'm not gonna put up with that.
Yeah, it's interesting that laughter really in the philosophical sense as well, that this ambivalence of existence itself. Also in the existentialists, for example, in Camus, we must imagine Sisyphus happy, that is rolling up the, kind of imagine him as laughing while he's rolling up the hill, and the stone up the hill. And in Zen Buddhism also there's this idea of kind of this crazed Zen monk that is just laughing at the fact of existence and the fact of it all. And from Keats there's also this poem, Why Did I Laugh Tonight? Where he's mainly talking about death and like kind of this tension inherent in how can you laugh in this existence, but you laugh anyway.
And I think that's why Rick and Morty is so funny, right? Because it always puts like a mirror in front of you of how pathetic and worthless life itself is. And it's a real sting in your heart, but it's really important to be able to laugh at yourself about putting so much value on your own life and always trying to find meaning in life. I mean, that's the absurdist crisis in Camus, right? That you're always going to look for meaning and you're never going to find it, and that can be a really great source of a joke. And that's just another example where jokes or laughter really help to cope with stuff that you can do nothing about.
That's kind of at the end of it all. What do you have but making fun of it?
Yeah.
drinking these beers while recording the podcast really changes the mood. Starting to slip into that melancholic Friday night, what is existence mode of thinking. Yeah, we had a short water closet break. Now we're going to talk about the more meta aspects of working as a researcher, doing a PhD, investigating interesting topics every day. You recently started your PhD.
Mm-hmm.
How is the research life going? Especially because it's kind of an interesting contrast to the guests we previously had here that were more from the hard science part of the sciences and not so much the humanities. So what do you do every day, and how does research actually work in your field?
I don't know if it's that different actually, but maybe because I don't know anything about the natural scientists that you talk with. But no, seriously, it's chill and stressful at the same time. But that's probably the answer that everybody would give you. So I don't know. My usual work day, I don't even bother wearing actual pants.
Yeah, that's a feature of Corona times.
Yeah, but that definitely is a feature of Corona because I started working in August, and now we have November, right? Mm-hmm. We do have November, yeah.
We do have November.
We do. And in the beginning it was super chill, but I really miss being among people. But that's a Corona statement, not a work statement. So back to your question. Sometimes it feels like I'm not doing anything at all. And in the evening I'm super frustrated and not at all satisfied with my work because I've just read for 4 hours and then thought for 2 hours and then I've written some stuff and then I've did some actual quantitative or qualitative research, but obviously without any results within one day, and then I feel like I just lost control over the whole day, which then after a week I realized I did not at all because it was super useful. But yeah, in some moments I really struggle with what am I actually doing here. Probably that's healthy for research, but maybe it's not healthy for the people that are doing the research.
Yeah, doing a PhD is not associated with a great mental health.
Yeah, but at least you get paid poorly, right?
Look at all the advantages of not having job security, no future. Yeah, but that aside, so I think maybe one of the interesting differences between the humanities and the natural sciences is that your work is really the 2 hours of thinking after 4 hours of reading part is really more crucial in your field because your publications really mostly consist of more conceptual work and more abstract, not necessarily abstract, but more thinking about new theories and new analyzing certain things. But you can do simulations or calculations, or at least sometimes you can also do that, more of a quantitative approach, but it's more qualitative work, and publications for you are really more this journal articles where you look at a certain topic like this gangster rap debate, for example, and really kind of try to understand that from the perspective of a lot of other researchers.
Yeah, and I really do enjoy that because in some senses it is like just being an author and just writing about what you want to write about. But then obviously there are some downsides on that. For example, that many people don't take you seriously, and maybe rightfully so, because obviously it is all subjective in the end. You cannot escape that, being a subject, obviously. But then I think as a linguist, compared to many branches of philosophy and sociology, you sometimes have the advantage of being able to work quantitatively fairly well, I would say. So at least it does make sense if you explain to other people, it does make sense that you can count words and you can count word patterns and you can compare those word patterns within a certain discourse with other word patterns within another certain discourse. And then you can drive your conclusions from that, or at least you have a good enough reason to look into specific texts which seem to be some sort of emblematic for a whole discourse.
Can you give a concrete example of that? That's stuff you already looked into.
So I don't know how concrete it's gonna get because I'm still in the humanities. But one example, just in general, what we're doing now, for example, where I'm working as a research associate, is that we're comparing the legislative discourse about marriage and family with the not legislative discourse, like with the common people discourse, which there are huge corpora for. And there are some computational linguistic tools like word embeddings, for example, which are actually designed for finding different actual meanings of the same word. So if you have the word, no, in English it doesn't make sense, but can you give me an English ambivalent or ambiguous term?
Maybe.
In German I would have said bank. So, well, in English it would work as well. The sandbank, right?
Yeah, I think bank also works.
So if you have the word bank and you have a huge corpus with many occasions of the same word, and then there's different meanings of bank as an institution where you put your money, and bank as just an accumulation of sand on the beach or anywhere, then you could really get that emergent meanings from different texts by using word embedding, which I don't totally understand, obviously, because I'm not a computational linguist. But how it works is more or less it projects the co-occurrence of words, so the other words that they that arrive in the context of the same word as vectors, and thereby different patterns arise if you have enough texts. So the one word of the one meaning of bank and the one meaning of bank, it would arise more often with the context within the context of money and economics and all that, and in the other sense more like with sun and beach and ocean and whatever. And obviously that's a really trivial example, but that's why I used it as an example. So if you do the same with marriage, you could more or less reliably find this different usages in different meanings of the same word or the same expression, which the users of language are mainly not even aware of when they utter it. So that's that's just one example, and that is the kind of quantitative research that you can do as a linguist, where you also can just consider words as the more or less best mental correlates of actual cognitive processes that you cannot just look at from the outside. That actually, I was starting my research, I was actually surprised how many people really think highly of linguists for that matter, because I've always been like super humble about what we can actually do, and I still am. But I think compared to philosophers and sociologists, for example, we have a fairly good stance within the humanities, I would say. Maybe thanks to Chomsky, even though we're not doing what Chomsky does at all. But
having the most
maybe it was him.
most cited living person.
Yeah, exactly.
Since after Freud and Marx or something like that.
But I think that was probably mainly because of his criticism of the US foreign affairs.
Do you think? I think Chomsky, didn't he get like famous before he started being very politically involved?
I think you have to have some amount of fame to become politically involved in the first place, because otherwise it's no fun, because nobody would listen to you, right?
In my perception, it was always like he was a linguist, and I think his theories just came at the right place and the right time, because that whole emphasis on language and structuralism, post-structuralism, and it was really something philosophy was taken by and really obsessed with to a degree. And then having that combination of linguistics, neuroscience, philosophy, and Chomsky, something that was just appealing to very interdisciplinary, like this intersection between a lot of fields.
Yeah, true. And also the whole take on it, like looking at language as some sort of natural force. I think that was kind of appealing to people, even though he was not at all the first person to do that take. But yeah. And the whole universalism thing, I think that was kind of just fascinating to people. But do you have any quotables in mind from Chomsky? Because I don't actually.
Yeah, I just remember from Pinker's attempts to explain what Chomsky was about, that he always made fun of. Like, has anyone actually read the Chomsky papers? They are extremely difficult to understand and extremely technical. And sometimes it's just puzzling to linguists why they are Chomsky acquired the level of fame he did. Maybe I don't know if there's a good comparison from physics or something, that you have a theory that's really, in quantum physics maybe to a degree, but quantum physics is extremely useful from a technical perspective as well. But a theory that really, when you strawman it really captures the imagination of a lot of people, which is if you break it down in a vaguely correct but not really correct sense. It's really appealing. I think that might have been the case with Chomsky, but that
Definitely.
Might
I think
also
that
not do him justice, because I think from a technical linguistic level he had interesting and fascinating insights, and he was important for the field. But
I feel like he was way more important for informatics than for linguistics. Actually, I don't. In our studies, we don't read Chomsky. I've never had to read Chomsky in my studies. Actually, maybe that's just the course of my university. I don't know, but I feel like his whole idea of a language being able to be derived from a few certain axioms and a few universals, like grammaticality, for example, it seemed to has worked well for informatics, but for language, for natural language, it didn't seem to work that well. So I don't know if his impact maybe was actually bigger on informatics than in the linguistic field.
I think we could go on talking for forever. Let's maybe to slowly move towards wrapping this whole conversation up. What are your future or near future projects? What are you going to look at? What is interesting to pursue?
Yeah, I think to bridge it a little bit, what you said about certain physical experiments or theories who got taken off super simplistically or poorly, and then become popular without anybody understanding them. I noticed that there is a tendency for that with linguistics too, with certain platitudes like, language forms the mind and language just creates reality and all of that, and it does, but I don't buy that. I don't buy that anybody understands it nearly as well as they claim. So I don't understand it, but I understand it well enough to know that nobody understands it as well as they said. So it has that. It is easily instrumentalized politically. We talked about political correctness and all that, but it's become that sort of platitude that if you say something, then you're just delivering the idea that is somehow within the word, and then you just brainwash everybody that listens to that. And I would like to actually look into that. So my research question would be, in what sense language actually contributes to social change? Because obviously it does, because all the culture is constituted by language. But I think people have a too simple understanding of that in most cases. I don't believe that it is about single words which deliver a certain concept. But I think it's way more complex, and I think that is it's many factors playing into it.
As we saw in the taboo example, you have a certain word that is taboo, but not the word is taboo, but the meaning behind the word. So the signified, not the signifier, is taboo. And people with that naive approach to linguistics and the world try to alleviate the problem by changing the signifier, by changing the word. But that obviously doesn't work. But that relies on a very simplistic understanding of how language constitutes reality. Exactly.
I think it doesn't work. And also, it's not needed for social change. Maybe it does have benefits. I don't know. That's why I'm starting the research on it. But if you take the example of the sun down, we know that the sun is not actually going down on the horizon, but we still use the same word, and it doesn't really hinder us from accepting that the Earth is actually moving around the sun and around itself, and that's why the sun is sometimes there and sometimes it's not. But we still use the same word, and we acknowledge that the concept of a sun down derives from the false thinking that the sun would actually go down and the Earth would stand still. But that thinking does not continue even though we use the same word. So there are millions examples like that, where our language is still super antiquated and we don't even think about that. So the impact of these antiquated words on our thinking and the potential of these antiquated words to actually deliver some sort of antiquated thinking is, I think, hugely exaggerated in the public and in many publications as well. And I don't think that there's enough research done there. At least I'm super interested in that field, so that's what I'm gonna focus now on.
And that sounds very exciting. So I'm looking forward to having you on this podcast again in a couple of months, or to see what progress you've made, and to also talk about these.
That's a lot of pressure for humanities.
Yes, we talk in a decade.
Yeah, maybe that.
We shall meet again. Then you have written your first book. Just kidding.
Fair enough.
So thanks for joining us on this podcast. And
thanks for having me.